Good morning. Kia ora.
Thank you for having
Chlöe
me.
Swarbrick. The first question, given the loss of jobs, especially in hospitality, how are you going to create jobs in Auckland Central?
I think one of the most important opportunities that we have right now is to figure out how we want to rebuild. So we don't need to go back to business as usual, where there were a number of people who felt, particularly in hospitality and retail, as though they were oftentimes in a position of circulating around the gig economy, not having all too much job certainty, and definitely not being paid all too well. And it's interesting walking along, a number of different streets around Auckland Central, whether it's in Waiheke or in the city side, but particularly in Ponsonby, on Ponsonby Road, and down those side streets. What you find is that a number of businesses there who have invested in their local community and in their workers, a number of them are doing all right. For those that haven't, there is the opportunity to perhaps pull together in some form of collective. I've got background experience in doing exactly that. But also to look at some of the coolest things that happened in Christchurch after the tragedy that was the earthquake, where we had a pop-up of a collective org called Gap Filler, who basically figured out how to connect landlords with empty spaces with tenants that were looking at taking on shorter term leases. So some pretty innovative and creative, funky things. I think that would be a really awesome opportunity to activate some of those spaces in a shorter term.
That's a good idea. What are your plans for Auckland's infrastructure and transport?
So I was really actually quite stoked because the other day, about a week ago now, we released the Greens Future of Transport Policy, which is completely independently costed and effectively has a massive focus on intercity, that is between different cities, and within city, rail and public transport. The big benefit of focusing on that mass transit is that we end up taking more cars off the road. So people who do need to use those cars have the opportunity to do so without sitting in a huge amount of congestion. But also if you look at international cities across the world, the benefit of living in one or visiting one is always that you don't need a car. Whereas Auckland has grown in such a way without all too much planning that we've fostered a real sense of car dependency, which in turn means we all get frustrated because it's the only way we can get around. And here I refer to one of the more eloquent things that's been, he's very eloquent unto himself, but eloquent ways that transport has been envisioned to me. By Luke Wejohn, who is a former school striker. He actually was my youth parliamentarian.
We interviewed him.
Oh, Luke's fantastic. He
went to the Western Springs.
He did go to Springs, and he's now a Green Party candidate and is finding himself being an activist against the cutting down of the Canal Road trees. But Luke spoke about how when he first got a bike, the freedom that gave to him to not have to have any money in his back pocket to pay for things like fuel. But we need to make sure that all of that infrastructure needs to be available to our kids so that it is safe. Because right now we fathom a car as freedom, but in any developed city around the world it doesn't have to be. We can have that freedom and that affordability and that access to our arts and our culture, our small businesses and our communities simply by investing in the right kind of infrastructure.
How are you planning to support SMEs, small to medium-sized businesses, during this economic recession?
So I've already been in contact with a number of them who have been having some challenges with some pretty large commercial landlords. Since March, for example, I've been engaged with, that was the first lockdown, with those in St Kevin's Arcade and in Elliot Stables who are having some challenges of, as I was kind of alluding to before, the traditional commercial agreement for a tenancy has a personal guarantee, which is an axe hanging above somebody's neck, particularly in such unprecedented times that we keep all talking about. But also these ever-extending time periods which become almost impossible to fulfill, and just trying to figure out how we can rebalance that power from a legislative place. I was working with Andrew Little and Stuart Nash, both ministers involved in SMEs and those commercial arrangements. We unfortunately, the politics became relatively public therein. Didn't manage to get that legislative arrangement, but did get funding available for those small businesses.
Good on you.
So that has been a massive kind of part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But basically, my experience in both politics and in small business, which was my history, I ran a little art gallery and coffee shop before I was elected for about a year, Mount Eden in the Crystal Palace. So I also have a big fascination with heritage.
Oh, I thought you were going to say crystals.
No, definitely not. I'll leave that to other types of greens. But what I've learnt from both of those things is that the focus has to be on relationships. And it has to be on community building.
Yeah.
Because no contract is ever going to work well if people are in a period of animosity, stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
So trying to bring both of those sides around the table has been a real focus for me as a local advocate.
Yeah, yeah. What should the incoming government do about taxation?
So that's been a nice space to discuss in 2020, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it was put best by Iona Holstead, who is the Secretary of Education to the Ministry of Education, when she said that COVID-19 didn't create inequality, it merely exposed it. We have the highest rates of wealth inequality in this country since the 1980s, the lowest rates of home ownership since the 1960s. And in speaking about this wealth inequality, I don't want to hold out any form of blame for anybody who was in a certain place in a certain time when they were making investments that made sense for them and their family and for security. But the fact of the matter is that without recalibration of our tax system, people who are working incredibly hard, who are paying quite high proportions on income tax, are paying a disproportionate amount to those who simply make money off of owning things, because there isn't that equivalent wealth or asset tax. So the Greens Poverty Action Plan is another one of our top 6 fully independently costed policies. It effectively says that we don't need to have poverty in this country if we ensure that everybody lives above the poverty line. That is outlined as $325 per week, a guaranteed minimum income. I think there's also probably an element of empathy in many folks realising what it's like to go on the benefit or require government support during this time. So hopefully we realise that, you know, the benefit at its present levels doesn't enable somebody to save or to plan for the future. So that's a really important springboard. And how we pay for it is by changing our tax system. That's, you know, to compare it to, for example, Labour's policy would increase taxation on the top 6%. It would bring in $500 million, that's $500 million per year. That doesn't touch the sides on what we're currently borrowing per week. Whereas if we increase that top 2% to the top 6% per the Greens policy, then we can eradicate poverty. So that's effectively our policy. But of course everything ends up coming out in the wash as we negotiate through. So if people want to see those kinds of bold plans to genuinely tackle these issues, not just talk about them, then we need more Green MPs.
My big hate at the moment is glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup. It's been declared a carcinogen by the WHO scientists. Would you call for it to be banned on our berms, parks and reserves in Auckland Central?
I can refer to actually the mahi that's been done by former Green MPs on this. So in 2016, Stefan Browning, who's a Green MP based out of Nelson, effectively did exactly that. And in doing so started a campaign called Spray Free Streets. The reason in investigating this that I've found since running in local government elections that we do use this probable carcinogen per the WHO is cost. And this again, my friend,
I've heard this before.
It comes down to the things that we value, but it also comes down to the ways that we prefer to have our berms look uniform, and not necessarily buy into how they can actually contribute to an ecosystem locally in an urban way. So my friend Sarah Smuts-Kennedy, who runs For the Love of Bees, used to run Griffiths Garden in the middle of town, now runs OMG Organic Market Garden, and also it's just off of Simon Streets, and also a place down at Wynyard Quarter, has some fantastic modelling for how in an urban environment we can stop the use of these sprays, these chemicals, and how we can move towards actually growing food in on those small patches like our berms and otherwise.
Why not?
But we just need to
get them to stop spraying, because your berm could be organic, and then they spray.
But it would, exactly. It would carry.
It would carry.
So I think that there is probably actually appetite for this. So talking to folks, there is interest in it. The real challenge is the balance of ownership of those berms, because you'll be aware that outside of people's properties, most folks aren't necessarily aware that those berms are owned by the council as opposed to part of their property. So how do we go about developing a construct or a concept of ownership or guardianship of that space where we all have a vested interest? Because the other thing to note is this wouldn't and couldn't only be an Auckland Central thing, because if you're sat on the border of Mount Albert,
it should be a super city thing.
Yeah, and there's the potential to do it, but it will cost money. And right now, all local government has to raise that resource is rates, and that's a challenge as well. So we need to bring together all of those very complicated, nuanced issues, but we need to make a commitment as a city to do it.
Thank you. Who other than returning New Zealanders should we let into New Zealand in the next, say, 6 months?
So I have been speaking to a number of people who were on working visas or were residents who are now stranded overseas. There is obviously some ambiguity about the different levels and arrangements that they had with Immigration New Zealand. But it does seem as though there are some real challenges with people being left stranded, and I really want to empathise with that.
Yeah, of course.
Because what happens when you have kind of a sledgehammer to crack a walnut is some people end up being left behind. So there's that. There's also those who have already actively invested or in goodwill put funds down to, for example, come and study here. So I think that there needs to be consideration of how we can support them, because they have already invested in a relationship with us. But I think that all of these things need to consistently be done from a health-based approach, from a public health approach. And we are in such unusual times, as everybody continues to say. And to see only the other day the President of the United States contracting the virus, actually, and was at an Auckland Central debate, and Melania, his wife. And just people, I think, finally perhaps understanding how serious this
virus is.
Hey,
what's one policy, apart from the cannabis, what's one other policy that you would introduce in the first year?
There's so many things other than, cannabis just tends to be the issue that I am most controversially associated to, so I end up talking about it the most, but it's definitely not my biggest driving kind of force. The things that interest me the most are justice and equality, and justice in all of its forms. So, I'm really interested in how we can get better outcomes in education, how we can have better outcomes in our justice system, our so-called justice system, how we can make sure that everybody has access to mental health support that works for them, how our houses in this country, particularly those at the lower end of the spectrum, are literally giving our kids third world diseases in the form of rheumatic fever. So to delve into and just pick only one, and to leave aside my pet project of constitutional reform, for me it would probably be the deployment of a serious strategy of mental health support, because I think we did this work that we instigated in the first 100 days in the last term in the Greens mental health spokesperson of Te Ara Oranga, the mental health and addiction inquiry. It identified that people can have a biological predisposition, so potentially you're born with some form of genetics that mean you're more inclined to manifest those issues. But then your environment, your life experiences, your relationships and everything else can contribute to that being dialed up or dialed down. So for so many people, I think it's that experience of isolation and of trauma and of uncertainty and of a sense of hopelessness. So figuring out how we build community again has to be a really key part of that long-term strategy. And that's meaningfully what a strategy towards well-being would look like.
Now this is my question. Do you think the incoming government should appoint a Minister for Animals?
Yes. And it's something that Gareth Hughes, who was our former animal welfare spokesperson, is retiring at this election, advocated for very strongly, and he almost had it on the table. And you know, you've seen that there has been some substantive pushback from animal NGOs and welfare groups like SAFE, who have continually said that whilst the government's done a bit, it hasn't done anywhere near as much, and the Greens are very much in that boat.
Well, that's my go-to charity, SAFE. Should we ban live animal exports? Yes
Absolutely.
or no?
Yes, the Greens' position is absolutely yes.
Perfect, thank you.
We come up against unnecessary pushback on that, but I think that the most recent tragedy, and here I think I need to also realise that there were, to state that we lost 40 people who were on that boat alongside thousands of animals.
Yeah.
All of this is just a disaster. So.
Yeah, I know. Okay, here's your question. Will you vote yes or no to the cannabis legislation and control
bill? I will be voting not because I like, use or support cannabis. I will be voting yes because I believe in better public health outcomes. I've seen the harm that cannabis can cause through prohibition, where people end up being upsold to far harsher substances. And for me,
that's synthetic cannabis.
Synthetics
is really terrible.
Is absolutely the worst, and the reason that so many people begin to use it is because it doesn't show up in drug tests, so it's not like cannabis.
Right.
But it also is cheaper and usually more readily available than cannabis.
Yeah.
So if you look at the Netherlands, who 47 years ago effectively created local regulations for the sale of cannabis.
Yeah.
They have no gateway hypotheses. People do not escalate to using harsher substances. In Aotearoa we do. The gateway is the black market, and we have a chance to shut that down when it comes to cannabis.
It could be like Colorado, like California, like Amsterdam.
Far more like Amsterdam, to be honest with you, because Colorado and California have far more of a commercial type of model.
Yeah.
We are probably somewhere between the spectrum of Uruguay, which actually was the first country in the world to legalise, people just don't know that.
No.
Or Canada.
I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, so I've met with, when I was in Vienna at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs not all too long ago, a number of officials and actually politicians from Uruguay who spoke to how much harm they've been able to reduce in the community by virtue of taking control of the sale and supply of that substance.
Excellent. Will you vote yes or no to the end of life bill?
Complete disclosure here, I worked on the cross-party group to progress that legislation.
Right.
So myself, alongside obviously David Seymour from ACT, Chris Bishop from the National Party, Ruth Dyson from Labour, we all came together to figure out how to tighten up that legislation. For me, a really important point of advocacy was to remove the qualifying feature of disability sole. So people with grievous and irremediable bodily harm can't qualify. So only those with terminal illness. My position on this is to recognise that it is rather actually greyer than, for example, the cannabis issue, which is simply a health or a justice issue. There are issues of autonomy, of choice and control here. But I come to it with the perspective that I know for a fact, and coroner's reports show for a fact, that there are people right now who end up deciding to, in their terminal final days, take their life in very miserable, awful, violent ways because they don't have access to these opportunities. There's also a legal grey area in palliative care where people can be prescribed, and those prescribing know that the offering of excessive amounts of morphine or other types of drugs will accelerate death, which is effectively kind of euthanasia. At present. So I would prefer that we have legal clarity over that. But I also, recognise here the diversity of opinions, particularly amongst tangata whenua.
Would you increase the superannuation age from 65?
No. I think that one of the best things that we've ever done actually in Aotearoa was to introduce the pension. The interesting thing about the pension, if you look back at Hansard, which is a record of parliamentary debates, when it was first being debated at the end of the 1800s, is that all of the arguments that are currently used towards beneficiaries about how it's cruel to support people with income and that they need to go to their families to get support were used against pensioners, there was an argument from conservative forces to not introduce a pension.
Yeah.
But subsequent to the introduction of it and looking at where we stand in relation to the rest of the world, that universal pension is responsible for the lowest rates of elderly poverty comparable to other jurisdictions in the OECD.
Yeah.
The Greens' position is actually not that we should be increasing the age of eligibility for super, but in fact that we should be thinking about how we can increase support for all people so that everybody has the opportunity to survive and thrive and pursue things that make our communities stronger.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting conversations that I've had with people who have gone into retirement is that now they finally get to do the things that they want to do.
Yeah.
Imagine how much more well-being would exist in our society if all of us had the opportunity to do those things, and how much we would be gearing our society and our economy, which by the way is defined simply by the allocation of our resources, towards things that matter.
Yeah. Now, that was my final question. Is there anything else in, say, 30 seconds that you'd like to say? Why should we be voting for you
in
for Auckland Central?
I live in Auckland Central. I've studied here. I've run small businesses here. I love it here. This is my home and it would be a privilege to represent it.
Yeah.
Auckland Central has a fascinating history of backing independent thinking, hard-working people with their boots on the ground. And I think that not only with my past 3 years in government, but also my history of working in small business and otherwise, has demonstrated that I can be that person, and it would be an honour to represent our home.
And hopefully you can encourage more younger people to vote.
That's what we're doing. I'm going out across all of the university campuses, and I'm also making sure that we're talking to a number of flats. We've been having some kind of cottage meetings there, and I think one of the real challenges with getting the amorphous mass of younger people, the kind of missing million, to vote is younger people are not apathetic in my experience. They simply don't necessarily trust the systems to deliver the change.
Yeah.
So it's helping them reconnect with the idea that our government is simply the sum of its parts, and that it is exactly what we think it deserves, what we think we deserve, basically.
Yeah.
So, if you want change, sitting on the sidelines and giving a hall pass to bad actors is never going to achieve that.
No. Hey, Chlöe Swarbrick, good luck on the 17th of October. We wish you well.
I'm really looking
for the Green
forward to
Party.
it. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.